They're all dead because of you, Snake. You failed them, and you'll keep failing. Again and again.
I'm still in a dream, Snake Eater.
Big Boss is a polarizing character because, more often than not, simply depending on when you got into the Metal Gear series would often determine whether or not he's your favourite Snake. And that's the way Kojima wanted to keep it, because if you learn about Big Boss's full life story too early, if at all, the appeal of his persona that comes from the early games, well, it gets a little bit diluted. Spin-offs aside, out of Kojima's 9 Metal Gear titles, he was the playable character in 3 games, and featured in another 4. And so while Solid Snake was the playable character in 5 games, he didn't appear in any others, so on screen time alone, Big Boss hasn't beat. The thing is, Big Boss is not actually a protagonist in the traditional sense, at least he was never supposed to be. What he is an antagonist, that being the big bad villain, with a complex and playable backstory. Because by the end of his tale, he is one mean and twisted old son of a gun. The biggest issue with Big Boss's story is that it's not told in chronological order, with a vital chapter of his downfall being told during the often unplayed original MSX titles. Not knowing this essential part of his tale, or missing any of the countless retro tweaks Kojima scattered throughout the series, makes it extremely difficult to understand his significance within the Metal Gear franchise, and that's a shame because he makes up some of Kojima's most insightful and original work. To walk away with a full appreciation of Big Boss, I believe there are 3 fundamental aspects to cover. Working backward, the final element will be the full story, told in chronological order with all of the retcon and narrative additions in place. You can jump forward to the end if you're strapped for time. I have marked it in the chapter list, but I wouldn't advise it because it's pretty hollow without the backstory. Before that, we need to look at how he was originally presented to the player, in release order, which means to say his original story told without context, when his only real purpose for existing was as a shocking plot device to make Solid Snake look even more heroic. But the first thing that is essential to cover before we get stuck into Big Boss is to understand why he was upgraded to a playable character in the first place, which comes down to 3 things that Kojima wanted to purge from the series: Solid Snake, the techno-thriller era in which he existed, and the mashup of pop culture tributes that were getting more attention than Kojima had bargained for, because the decision to swap out Solid Snake and the Tomorrow's World setting was what cleared a path for Big Boss to exist as anything beyond a cameo.
Here's your dream.
You see, back in 1995, the PlayStation achieved global success, and that gave Kojima a platform to expand his successful but relatively unknown MSX series, Metal Gear, to audiences around the world. These official games helmed by Kojima are the ones I'll be focusing on in this video, as they're generally considered true canon, and the other ones can get a little bit, well,
Nanomachine, son.
weird. It should probably go without saying, spoilers ahead. I hate to ask, but if you could do me a solid and like, or better yet subscribe, I would be eternally grateful, as just a little click from you is a massive win for me. Right, plug over. As I was saying,
Am I too late?
so it's 1998. Metal Gear Solid has hit the shelves to critical acclaim, and the West are introduced to Solid Snake, the square-jawed, bandana-rocking super soldier. However, Snake has actually already headed up 3 titles by this stage, the first 2 on the MSX, and now Metal Gear Solid, and Kojima is already starting to get a bit bored of him, keen to sideline Snake in order to expand the universe with unfleshed-out characters. And while Kojima may have had the best of intentions when he created Raiden, the fair-haired juxtaposition to Snake, meant to serve as a shell that any player, male or female, young or old, could fill, he unfortunately failed to anticipate quite how lukewarm the West's reaction would be. Mainstream Western audiences had only had a taste of Snake and they wanted more. To make matters worse, the planned finale of Metal Gear Solid 2 had featured Arsenal Gear levelling Manhattan, and so when the tragic events of 9/11 occurred just weeks before release, Kojima and his team had to rapidly cut over 300 sections of the game. And they did go on to receive critical acclaim, but only by the skin of their teeth, with Kojima himself offering to step down and leave the company in shame, and needing to be talked out of it by the CEOs of Konami and Sony. And so it was of no surprise when Kojima, Konami and Sony unanimously decided to shift the focus away from the modern day techno-thriller premise, with its large-scale acts of terrorism that hit far too close to home. But what period would they choose, and which hero would helm the adventure? Kojima's practice of crafting worlds out of a patchwork of elements appropriated from pop culture is widely recognized.
By sub, we'll launch a one-man SDV.
Submarine, one-man submersible.
And as a result, the Metal Gear series features a boiling pot of overlapping themes. But at its core, you will always find political espionage drama infused with futurism. And this would serve as a platform for the larger-than-life characters whose intertwining schemes would carry the plot forward.
Who are you?
When crafting the characters in particular, Kojima would be most brazen with his tributes, copying details right down to things like names, visual appearances, and motivations. Snake himself started life as Carl Reese from the Terminator in the first Metal Gear game, although Kojima always denied credit for that one. And in Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake, he evolved into Martin Sheen from Apocalypse Now, and he could actually be seen here alongside the earliest visual appearance of Big Boss, a pixel-perfect duplication of Sean Connery, as if you need telling. We'll circle back around to him in a minute. But back to Snake, and moving swiftly on to Metal Gear Solid, he was next modelled on Christopher Walken from The Deer Hunter, and considering Kurt Russell's iconic character Snake Plissken was the basis of Solid Snake's name,
Call me Snake. Call me Snake.
in Metal Gear Solid 2, Kojima really began to toe the line between tribute and copyright infringement.
You're pretty good. Pretty good.
With Snake not just taking on the appearance of an ugly Kurt Russell clone.
My name is Pliskin. Iroquois Pliskin.
Bear in mind that Snake lived in Alaska and Iroquois translates to real snake in the Inuit language, or rattlesnake according to one of the codec conversations, but basically Iroquois Pliskin translates to real snake Pliskin. Yeah. Kojima seemingly did this in the hopes that he could coax Russell into taking over the role from David Hayter.
Kojima, he asked one of the producers on Metal Gear 3 to ask Kurt Russell if he would take over for that game.
While John Carpenter, who was the creator of the Snake Plissken movie Escape from New York, generally had nice things to say about Kojima,
Why am I? I'm not gonna do that.
Kurt Russell, on the other hand, has actually always been pretty outspoken in his disapproval of Kojima's choice to copy aspects of his character.
That's not written by John. That doesn't smell right.
And when it came to Snake's character and methods, he didn't actually align with Plisken at all. Snake's biggest influence was in fact James Bond, whose movies Kojima has long counted amongst his favourites. Both are expert infiltrators known to sneak through the corridors of isolated fortresses, dispatching goons, facing off with overpowered henchmen, flirting with women.
Well, I know I won't be bored for the next 18 hours.
Getting captured, listening to Megalomaniac's monologue, escaping with style, dispatching said megalomaniacs, dropping one-liners,
That takes care of the cremation.
getting the girl, sometimes losing the girl, setting off the bombs, and getting the hell out. Yeah, MGS is pretty much a Bond movie on steroids. And of course the tribute weren't even close to stopping with Solid Snake. His rival,
Liquid?
is so strikingly familiar to Roy Batty from Blade Runner, it's almost surreal. Both are striking blonde clones who, during a finale that consists of a shirtless fistfight up on a high ledge, reveal that their violent actions are actually just a front for their mission to save the lives of their fellow clones, slaves created by the government to serve the people cursed with short, miserable lives as a failsafe, just like the main character themselves.
The genome soldiers that you've been killing are our brothers.
The main character who, ironically, has been authorized to hunt down these very clones and kill them. Sound familiar? Yeah, the long hair doesn't fool anybody, Liquid. His tail mimics even the subtlest details of Batty's, to the point that it's actually bloody impressive that Kojima even managed to align them that closely. That said, Kojima's always cited Blade Runner as one of his favourite movies, which is why he so often clones it in his games. Clones, get it? And then there were all the other characters lifted from pop culture.
Get that stinking shit out of my face.
Just take the Predator's strongman, Blaine, who carried a 7.62mm M134 minigun.
Payback time.
Which, including its battery pack, motor, and pouch of 1,000 rounds, weighed in at around 40 kilos or 90 pounds. That is a goddamn lot. But we are supposed to believe that Mr. Universe himself looks up to this guy, so I think we can go with it. Now enter Vulcan Raven, who carries a 20mm M61 Vulcan rotary cannon, which, when paired with enough ammo to fire for the equivalent amount of time, which is about 20 seconds, it clocks in at closer to 200 kilos, or 440 pounds. So kind of like carrying a little Harley Davidson around. It also fires at 3 times the speed, I might add, and with enough pushback to slow down a supersonic jet. Raven is his own character, for sure, and he's great, but he's also just Blaine dialed up to 11. Psycho Mantis reflected the psychic levitation found in Brian De Palma's 1978 thriller The Fury. And Kojima's favourite film, 2001: A Space Odyssey, features a rogue AI named Hal, who, left unchecked, causes widespread carnage. That's a pretty good description of Otacon too, and his real name is Hal Emmerich. Django of widespread spaghetti western fame served as the template for Revolver Ocelot, and Ocelot himself mentions
We're going to launch that nuke and ride it all the way into history.
which alludes to a very famous scene in Kubrick's film Dr. Strangelove, no doubt a huge influence on Kojima due to its underlying warnings about nuclear weapons. And perhaps most importantly, the best of Japanese fiction had also been blazing a trail since the late 80s. First with Akira establishing a fan base for anime, and then that was reinforced a few years later when footage from a popular Japanese kids show called Super Sentai was recut with scenes of Western actors, and it became a smash hit under the name Mighty Morphin Power Rangers. And so, riding on the coattails of other Japanese imports that had proved popular in the West, Metal Gear Solid served up the gaming world a trendy techno-thriller adventure and injected it with some manga-inspired hyper-stylization, and the quirky visuals and bombastic narrative propelled it to success. But because Metal Gear Solid was the first time Kojima's work had ever received mainstream attention, never before had he been called out on indulging in such blatant acts of cloning popular fiction. And yet, as Metal Gear's exposure grew, there was a growing trend for fans and critics alike to identify and call out these references like kids on an Easter egg hunt. Up until Metal Gear Solid 2, Kojima had fundamentally drawn from the late 70s and 80s and 90s due to the techno-thriller focus, and as most players were of course intimately familiar with this exact period of cinema, it was easy pickings. And yet, Kojima's movie knowledge is the stuff of legend.
誕生日なのでちょっと偶然ですけども。
He's a notorious cinephile whose tastes know no bounds, and he didn't need to limit himself to these modern classics that were so easily identifiable. Not if he could shift the time and focus to a period of cinema that most gamers weren't familiar with, like the age of the classic spy of old. These classic spies were veterans of World War II, where allegiances between America, Britain and Russia amongst others had been forged in blood, and yet within a decade, friendships had been turned on their heads, with Allied Russia becoming the Cold War enemy, and Germany being torn down the middle, and most importantly,
Houston, this is Hawaii. We have an unidentified object on scope.
Order first alert. Arm all weapons.
Japan doing a 180 and becoming arguably one of America's closest and most reliable allies in the Asia-Pacific region.
Impregnable?
And these fast-shifting changes in allegiances, both on a national and personal level, meant the life of a secret agent was genuinely filled with suspicion and paranoia.
Look, your job and mine permit us to take human life. If I want to kill you, and I can only do it by putting a bomb in a restaurant, that's the way I'll kill you. That's what I'll do.
And this makes for great storytelling. And yet, as the years went on, writers like Tom Clancy and Michael Crichton would sweep the spy world forward into the age of techno-thrillers. And the true age of the spy moved further and further away, with evolving technology eroding the significance of the autonomous lone wolf. And this is important because Kojima was born in the 60s, and together as a family, from his youngest days, Kojima talks about how he was encouraged to pick a film every night that they'd watch together. And the recently accessible 60s cinema was dominated by spy thrillers and high-stakes political dramas, such as The Spy Who Came In From the Cold, or The Manchurian Candidate, or From Russia with Love, and just so many more. This is where Kojima's love of espionage and intrigue would take root. And so, with Konami asking for a game that predated the modern techno-thriller era, and Kojima only too happy to indulge in his love of Cold War espionage cinema, the final step was to pick a character who could tie the two timelines together, which was a simple enough choice because the only two characters in the series who were old enough were Snake's commanding officers, Colonel Campbell or Big Boss. And as we're talking about a period of cinema filled with subterfuge and turncoats and rife with stories of traumatized warfighters, or even soldiers transforming into megalomaniacs, settling on Big Boss wasn't really a choice at all. And this is of course where Kojima had to start, with a big boss who'd been designed without paying heed to his backstory. And when Big Boss is first seen in the founding Metal Gear game, he serves as Snake's faceless boss who directs the young Foxhound agent through the South African fortress known as Outer Heaven in order to find his missing squad member, Grey Fox, while investigating the weapon known as Metal Gear. And thanks to the luxury of having the entire timeline available to us, though it's not clear how or when, we know that as the leader of Foxhound and Snake's mentor, not only did he personally assign the codename Solid Snake to the young soldier known as David, and not only did he personally teach him the hand-to-hand techniques referred to as CQC, he also revealed to the rookie soldier that they are in fact father and son, although the significance of Snake in fact being a clone would later come from Liquid.
They used me as a guinea pig.
Once Snake has been sent in, he proves a better man for the job than anybody expected, and so Big Boss attempts to cut the mission short by ordering him to return home. But then Snake discovers the unthinkable. Dun dun dun! The rookie agent decides to follow his hero instincts, which results in a confrontation with the titular walking battle tank, and destroying Metal Gear triggers a classic countdown for base-wide destruction. Angered by this turn of events, Outer Heaven's mysterious leader blocks Snake's exit, and reveals him as none other than Foxhound's Commander-in-Chief, Big Boss. And so, with the overconfidence of a man who clearly thinks he's still the main character, he admits to his treachery and reveals his grand plans to the soon-to-be-deceased Solid Snake. Snake was just a pawn, supposed to report that he saw nothing, just like in Rambo 2. But he went too far, just like in Rambo 2. Thanks to the low budget, the game slightly glosses over the significance of Big Boss, Snake's father, being the world's greatest mass-murdering villain who is now announcing his intention to apparently kill his son. But I think it's safe to say that Snake doesn't take it too well. As a result, Snake unceremoniously reduces him to a vapor cloud. And then after that, the government reduces the entire of Outer Heaven to a vapor cloud. And that was the end of Big Boss. Or was it? With that, Snake escapes, gives up the life of a soldier, and tries to live in solitude. Probably because his psycho dad, Big Boss, friggin' traumatized him. And then, 4 years later, now under the command of the ever-popular Colonel Campbell, Solid Snake is called out of retirement and sent into Zanzibar land amidst reports that Metal Gear has been built once again. The base is bigger, badder, and more complex than before, filled with brightly dressed war orphans, ranks of military personnel, and a selection of kooky superpowered adversaries. And this time around, his old ally Grey Fox appears to be pulling the strings, and he leads Snake on a merry chase, forcing Snake to once again do battle with a walking tank before beating Fox to death atop a minefield. That was Fox's idea, so don't feel bad. Plus, he lit your head on fire, and also he survives.
Fox, stay out of this.
Yeah, let's not complicate things. Anyway, before the story concludes, it is revealed that the man whose Snake reduced to a smear on the wall back in Outer Heaven was not Big Boss at all, but a body double. And Big Boss lives. What we, the audience, wouldn't find out for another 25 years is that the identity of this body double was a loyal soldier known by the codename Venom Snake, one-time protagonist of the Phantom Pain. Kojima is the king of retcons, let it never be denied. But goddamn, what a pitiful ending for Venom. Of course, Snake doesn't know all this, having believed Grey Fox to be the man behind the curtain, and as he heads for the exit, Big Boss intercepts him for a big reveal. And so, before they fight, Big Boss takes the opportunity to deliver his monologue, and it goes on a bit, but in short he explains in very clear terms that he's addicted to battle, and killing essentially. And so he's masterminded this entire operation 3 times now, which has led to untold amounts of death and suffering so that he can continue to feed his bloodlust. Because once a man becomes a soldier, killing is the only pleasure they will ever know. Better than sex, apparently. Snake trades a few verbal jabs and insists that he just wants to be free of the nightmares, which is a rare glimpse behind his stoic facade that he suffers from PTSD. Something which sadly isn't really explored all that much, but none of that detracts from the fact that when Big Boss lays it out in front of you, it does seem like a pretty feeble excuse for creating a war machine that rolled over the surrounding countries, killing families to produce orphans that he raises himself and turns into cannon fodder. You've seen those children, victims of war from many nations, and budding soldiers for the next war. Employ, assist, make victims, nurse and train. And back to the battlefield again. It's pretty dark stuff. Now, it isn't hard to find historical reports that detail how excessive bloodlust was encouraged amongst Japanese troops during the Second World War, nor stories about how many of them struggled to readjust into society as civilians after and were often treated with widespread contempt, which of course was famously a focus of American cinema in the wake of Vietnam as well. Considering that simply becoming a mercenary might have been less hassle if Big Boss just wanted to keep fighting and killing people, Kojima's perception of war veterans from his father's generation matched the global exposure of successful films like Apocalypse Now, The Deer Hunter, Full Metal Jacket, Platoon, and of course Rambo, every one of which can directly be found influencing the Metal Gear series. All of that might explain why Kojima implies such philosophical depth to Big Boss's almost surrealist mission of creating an unstoppable war machine that operates out of a Bond villain lair as a home for all the soldiers of the world who ever faced contempt when they returned home. And so this is the Big Boss character that Kojima had to work with his warped moral alignment, lack of any national allegiance, and murderous deeds set in stone. But if Kojima was able to create a prequel with an engaging narrative that could provide believable context to this fantastical notion, he would have succeeded in establishing an entire second character and timeline to work with, one that told the journey of a naive and open-minded patriot right through to a bitter and twisted aggressor. And it would rely on a period of history, and therefore works of fiction, that weren't common knowledge amongst the majority of his fans. And as this 60s cinema championed themes like treachery and shifting allegiances and betrayal, it seemed the perfect choice. And so Big Boss was stripped of his entire character, and with it all of his future sins, dropped into a 1964 setting and aptly renamed Naked Snake. He received his own mentor, the Boss, who was tasked with infiltrating a rogue branch of the Russian military in order to expose them as a nuclear threat. Snake's mission was to extract a defecting scientist, but it all goes wrong, and the rogue Colonel Volgin sets off a nuke which the Russians would subsequently blame on America. The Boss clashes with Snake and nearly kills him while revealing herself as a double agent working for Volgin, leaving Snake to die. From treachery through to rogue Russians, and defecting scientists through to nukes, Kojima successfully nailed about a dozen Cold War buzzwords in the intro alone, and did an excellent job of setting the game's tone. After a quick extraction, Snake is tasked with fixing his mess in order to clear America's name.
If you fail, you'll be back in a hospital bed again, waiting for the firing squad.
And so, after a lot of sneaking and fighting and dealing with treacherous and two-timing allies and flip-flopping, double-crossing, backstabbing adversaries, and a host of some of the most inventive and exciting boss battles to date, Naked Snake reaches his final confrontation with his mentor. Of course, Kojima wouldn't settle for any entry-level spy thriller tropes. This was his one chance to do the 60s proud, and so the big reveal is that the boss is in fact not a double agent at all. She's a triple agent. Kind of. Her allegiance is to her country, but specifically the shadow organization, the Philosophers, an international group of wealthy elites who would aspire to keeping the world and America safe, which would plant a rhetorical question within the mind of Big Boss and the series as a whole, which would ask, what is the moral or even legal difference between a soldier and a mercenary if countries themselves can be bought and sold, divided and conquered at the whim of the world's most powerful individuals? But the boss doesn't believe any of that matters as long as you're a patriot and you fight for your country. And she is a patriot. And like any good patriot, she's prepared to die for her country.
All that's left for you to take is my life.
So she orders Snake to kill her so that she can shoulder the blame for the nuke and allow America to keep on keeping on, and then tries her damnedest to kill the shit out of Snake.
Time to play rough.
But you beat her eventually thanks to your math skills and, you know, safe falls. With textbook timing, his Russian liaison turned lover is revealed to also be a triple agent when she steals the Philosopher's Legacy, a slush fund of $100 billion used to steer world events, from under Snake's nose.
And I'm sorry.
Her Chinese paymasters had intended for her to kill Snake, but she spares him, planting yet another seed in the young soldier's mind that speaks to the importance of respecting a soldier's autonomy and humanity. Because unlike the faceless superiors who issue orders to take lives, it's the soldiers on the ground that have to live with that decision, and when circumstances permit, can take the decision to spare lives.
I hereby award you the title of Big Boss.
Big Boss receives his accolades without a fuss, but is inconsolable, and his growing resentment leads him to turn away from his country. But, in true spy drama fashion, Eva had stolen a fake, with the funds finding their way into the hands of Snake's unit commander and ally, Zero. He invites Snake, amongst others, to join him in establishing the Patriots, a new shadow organization that would use the recovered funds to see beyond Cold War propaganda and steer world events for the greater good, in what they perceived to be the boss's image. Already famed for his exploits, Zero would make Snake the face of the organization.
Zero elevated Big Boss, the hero who saved the world, to the status of an idol. The truth behind Big Boss became riddled with exaggeration, misrepresentation, and outright lies. Zero disseminated these stories among the masses and gathered the rich and powerful to his banner.
Your legend has been told on every battlefield the world over. Obviously, as the tales have spread, the truth's been distorted. The problem is, fiction inspires people more than facts. To the world, you're now the legendary mercenary Big Boss.
But Zero grew to resent Big Boss's status, and also began to abuse his position of power, at one point authorizing a program to clone Big Boss in secret, called Les Enfants Terribles.
After dozens of failures, they finally, miraculously, succeeded in producing a fertilized egg,
which would lead to the births of what effectively were his sons, Solidus Snake, Liquid Snake, and Solid Snake.
But Les Enfants Terribles proved to be the final straw for Zero and Big Boss.
Their allegiance shattered, Zero wrested control of the organization and rebranded it as Cypher, also taking the name for himself. Big Boss indulged in the life of a mercenary for a while, before joining forces with a soldier he'd once spared to establish a mercenary outfit called Militaires Sans Frontières, or Soldiers Without Borders in less sexy English. 10 in-game years after the 1964 Snake Eater mission, the PSP sleeper hit Peace Walker, which was set in 1974, would recount these years as he launches missions from his base in Colombia. and establishes allegiances with key characters.
What's going on, Kaz?
Peace Walker's finale featured a clash with Cypher's double agent, Paz, who would attempt to launch a nuke in order to turn the world's nations against Big Boss.
I'm taking the weapon you built and using it to launch a nuclear strike on the east coast of the United States.
You're insane. What are you after?
You and your men will become pariahs, and you will be wiped off the face of the earth.
And his valiant attempts to stop her would be undermined by quite how irresponsible he'd been by stockpiling nukes in the first place. And, like, I don't know, leaving the keys in Metal Gear?
Pause. In the new age, armies won't be tied to states, and war will become a business.
It's not going to be that easy. We've put ourselves on the radar of intelligence agencies and governments east and west.
Then who are we gonna fight?
The establishment. Business will have to wait. The question we have to ask ourselves now is, can we survive long enough to see the 21st century? Assemble the men.
10 days ago, we got reports that Paz was still alive.
She survived.
She was rescued by a Belizean fisherman who found her drifting in the Caribbean.
So what's the plan? Silence her before we're compromised?
No. I've got something else in mind.
I'm in front of the prison camp.
Over the next year, Paz would transition to Turncoat. Big Boss's mission to extract her in the 1975 setting of Ground Zeroes would end in disaster, with Cypher crippling their organization and Big Boss being thrown into a coma. His loyal compatriot, known as the Medic, is placed in an induced coma alongside him, and when Big Boss awakens, he has his visage surgically imprinted onto the Medic.
Been watching over you for 9 years.
Before his friend and ally...
The name's Ocelot.
Yep. That Ocelot uses hypnotherapy to convince the Medic that he is in fact Big Boss himself, adopting a new code name of Venom Snake. However, Cypher are hot on their heels before the bandages are even off and the hospital is overwhelmed with killers, including super assassin Quiet, who at this stage is pretty big mouth for a silent killer.
The patient in the next bed's on my face.
Big Boss loyally defends the confused Medic in a bid to escape the hospital, before giving Venom one final reminder of what a sculpted snake ass should look like. 9 years of withering away in a coma could never soften a rock-hard rear end in a Kojima game. That would be weird. And finally he peels away, leaving Venom in the capable hands of his loyal followers in order that they keep the world distracted by continuing to fulfill his legacy. And Venom would do just that, amassing an army of disgruntled soldiers on the Mother Base oil rig as chronicled throughout the 1984 setting of the Phantom Pain. And this ends with Venom coming to terms with who he truly is.
You're Big Boss.
And deciding to live out his days in the role of Big Boss, which leads to a period of 11 years after the conclusion of the Phantom Pain, which was the final game Kojima produced.
That's your name as of today. Best change your face, too.
And the start of Metal Gear, which was the first game he produced. During this period, the real Big Boss would mastermind his true utopia in secret, establishing an independent nation of Outer Heaven within South Africa, which would effectively serve as an even bigger mother base. But the West knew nothing of their legendary soldier beyond the few years he spent overseas as a mercenary, and so once this base was completed, he was free to then return to America, where he was still seen as just a highly decorated soldier, and leave it in the hands of Venom, who would then go on to absorb the old mother base and the Diamond Dogs into this newer base of operations. And in America, Big Boss then took over his old unit of Foxhounds so that when Outer Heaven was invariably discovered, he would be in the perfect position to sabotage any mission sent against them by the American military. Officially, it was the completion of the nuclear-equipped TX-55 Metal Gear that prompted a response from the US government, but in reality, it was a continuation of the decades-old grudge match between Cypher and Big Boss. Cypher, which means to say Zero, pulled a few strings to steer America into conflict with Outer Heaven, and Big Boss, having seen it coming, had positioned himself as Foxhound's commander to intervene if indeed it would come to that. And of course, it did. his dream of utopia and his allegiance to Venom and the soldiers of Outer Heaven so unflinching, he would send his own loyal son, Solid Snake, on what was widely considered to be a suicide mission, made worse by the fact that he would actually be on site assisting Venom throughout. Unbeknownst to Snake, he had Big Boss at one end and Venom on the other, and between them they were trying their best to subvert his mission in order that he relay false information about the extent of Outer Heaven's threat. But as we know, they severely underestimated Snake, which led to Venom's anticlimactic end. Not to mention the discovery of Big Boss's treachery.
I was naive, you bastard.
That's right. Don't blame yourself. Blame me.
Followed immediately by his perceived death.
Hello, Ahab.
Ishmael. You've really kept me waiting.
I just wanted you to know that I've made it out safely. They won't suspect a thing. I never expected him to succeed.
It seems that Solid Snake was more competent than either of us gave him credit for. Quite a heavy tuition for such a meager lesson.
Outer Heaven won't die with you. As long as a man carrying the name of Big Boss is alive, there will always be someone striving to create a nation for soldiers. Are you familiar with Zanzibar Land? No. Never mind. It's not something you need to worry about anymore. Don't worry. I'll keep our dream alive.
In a final bid to secure freedom for the world's mistreated soldiers, he established a base of operations in an overlooked USSR border state, one which was landlocked between China and Pakistan and Afghanistan. He convinced the naive locals to declare independence and rely on his soldiers, which would be referred to as the Mercenary War, and this resulted in the independent state of Zanzibar Land being all but under Big Boss's control. And so, entering the final phase of his megalomaniacal transformation, he led Zanzibar Land in a campaign of expansion, invading neighbouring countries using the newly developed Metal Gear D, and stealing decommissioned nukes from sites around the world, becoming a nuclear superpower and a global threat, once again resulting in Solid Snake to come a-knockin', and indeed the final face-off that would ensue. This final fight is substantially lengthier than the time that Snake literally just bitch-slapped Venom from existence. After echoing the very same words that the boss delivered before her demise, Big Boss attempts to cut Snake deep with his words before moving on to bullets. I prefer to envision the final battle as something akin to some of the best fan art out there. The sluggish but seasoned veteran versus the focused and agile protege engaged in a mortal battle of attrition, the lives of thousands hanging in the balance. Yeah, sadly, that's not really how it happened. In fact, Grey Fox had set all Snake's stuff on fire earlier, so he had no weapons, and Big Boss had a gun pointed at him, and Snake straight up told BB that he's gonna kill him. Despite this clear disadvantage, Snake showcases his lightning-quick reflexes to duck and dodge and make it to cover, in what was no doubt a bit of hair-raising gunplay. He then proceeds to outmaneuver Big Boss using his superior sneaking skills, leverages his superior flexibility in order to squeeze into tight spaces and find misplaced door cards and so on, and this enables him to construct a makeshift flamethrower from a Zippo and a can of Axe, or Lynx depending on who had the import rights into Zanzibar Land. At this point, I really can't help but think back to the time that Big Boss set Quieter Flame.
We gave her a light. She took the short way down.
As we know, Kojima doesn't really do coincidences, and so this must surely be poetic justice.
Fight!
Hadouken! And that was the end of Big Boss. Or was, yeah, you can guess where this is going. After escaping and briefly trying to live the quiet life, Snake goes on to pretty much devote his entire life to cleaning up the mess born of Big Boss's legacy, from adversaries who believed in Big Boss's vision through to corrupt entities whose opposition to his vision would cause just as much carnage, with Metal Gears continuing to make appearances thanks to all the years of development that Big Boss had sunk into it. While this ironically means that Snake chooses to continue living the life of warfare just as Big Boss prophesized, thanks to Kojima's focus on non-violence in the games, it becomes increasingly apparent that Snake is a juxtaposition to Big Boss. He often solemnly admits that he is good at killing and seemingly lives for the joy of battle, but where possible he actually avoids killing because ultimately he's dedicated himself to saving lives, whereas Big Boss would become somebody who would ruthlessly spend them. Kojima could not possibly have fathomed how successful the series would become, and so wrote himself into a corner, with Big Boss's final actions being quite so twisted, making him an exceptionally difficult character to redeem. But that most certainly did not stop Kojima from taking a solid crack at doing it anyway. While some of Kojima's narrative choices have been pretty questionable over the years, to say nothing of the occasionally bizarre dialogue,
I won't scatter your sorrow to the heartless sea.
Fortunately, he was on his A-game when he constructed what would be the final chronological scene of the entire series. 15 years after the 1999 fall of Zanzibar land, and we reach 2014. Snake, now 42 but tragically cursed with rapid aging due to his makeup as a clone, visits Big Boss's grave with the intention of killing himself.
But there's one more thing I must do.
To eliminate the Fox-Die nanovirus he carries before it mutates and causes an epidemic that would kill millions. A selfless final act and tragic ends to a character whose lifetime of heroic deeds have gone all but unnoticed by the public at large. The last bit is a little far-fetched, but let's just go with it. After Eva recovered Big Boss's comatose body, parts harvested from the corpses of Liquid and Solidus were transplanted onto him, and he's fully reconstructed, bringing the comatose legend back to life for the sake of prosperity, just 1 year before his 80th birthday.
That's when we finally learned the location of this man, Zero.
And with his life returned, after cleaning up a few loose ends, he travels to the graveyard to confront his son.
That's right. Good. No need for you to go just yet. It's been a long time, Snake.
He has vital knowledge about Fox-Die, explaining that for now the virus is in fact subdued and should die with Snake.
Let it go, my son.
However, these very same alterations to the virus meant that upon contact, it would go on to kill him instead. Snake's final words before taking Big Boss down in Metal Gear 2 had been that he just wanted the nightmares to stop, and that he wanted to leave war behind. After 15 years in a coma, Big Boss awakens to find just one son left, and David has been fighting harder and longer than any other soldier he ever knew, having defeated a number of his best soldiers, including his double Venom, countless Metal Gears while on foot, every spy, killer and genetically enhanced variation of soldier the Patriots could muster, far, far surpassing his own vision of what defines the ultimate soldier, and yet, as demonstrated by his choice to end his own life, clung on to his humanity to the bitter end. Snake had been betrayed by his government just as Big Boss was, far more so in fact due to his shortened lifespan, but he didn't use any of it as an excuse to rebel, instead giving up on his dreams of a peaceful life and continuing to face the nightmare of war, succumbing to physical and mental trauma and never complaining once. And so in his final minutes, Big Boss confides in Snake that if it were he who'd been faced with the same terrible choices, he believes Snake would have made the right ones.
If you'd been in my place back then, maybe you wouldn't have made the same mistakes that I did.
He accepts that Snake is the better man, implying his pride as a father, realizing that via his own misguided actions, Solid Snake has in fact become the true successor to his own mentor, the boss, because Snake didn't manufacture a world around him to suit the life of a soldier, but instead used his life as a soldier to preserve the world around him, which is the true message the boss had tried in vain to impart.
Boss, you were right. It's not about changing the world. It's about doing our best to leave the world the way it is.
And so, having saved Snake from stealing away the final years of his dwindling life, he explains that his final wish for Snake is to just live, as he knows firsthand that Snake desperately wanted to do, to escape the system, leaving behind the codename Snake that he assigned him all those years ago.
That new world is yours to live in, not as a snake, but as a man.
And by doing this, Big Boss thus bookended the entire series with actions of a good man and a kind father. Now, if you could do me a massive solid, get it? No? Well, if you could do me a massive solid and like, or better yet subscribe, I would be eternally grateful, as just a little click from you is such a massive win for me. If you're interested in Kojima or the Metal Gear franchise, then I've got some fun videos on my channel, and I've also got a couple more lined up. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks very much for watching, and hopefully see you next time.